Hello, everyone. It's John Laughland. I'm the Director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I are delighted to welcome back onto the show Ewen Stewart. Ewen, you've been on the forum a couple of times before. You are a member of the Growth Commission in the United Kingdom, and you are a city economist. And you are perhaps one of the most pessimistic, or certainly lucid and pessimistic people about the state of Britain today. Britain has attracted attention, hasn't it, from around the world for changing prime ministers almost as often as people change their underwear. We're now on our 7th prime minister in 10 years. I think your view, Ewen, is that Britain is an advanced state of decadence. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that and tell us what your diagnosis is, if you're still there. Ewen? No, he's disappeared now.
He had some technical problems, but he will be, and he's going to come right back.
Can you hear us now, Ewen? Can you hear us now? No? Oh, dear.
Okay. I think he's going to leave and come right back in. I mean, one of the questions, and as we move forward, John, is that I'm very interested in what ails the UK. Is it any different than what's ailing other countries of the European Union? Is there something specific about, to use your word, decay for the UK as opposed to European countries? And
well, I think,
another question is what's happening in Britain. Is that America's future?
Yeah, well, I don't want to preempt what Ewen would say, but I do know some of his work, and he does say that Britain shares a lot of Europe's weaknesses. It's just that in many respects they are worse. I mean, I think in other respects Europe is worse, but the continent as a whole, including Britain, suffers from, according to him anyway, a whole range of weaknesses. They include very high taxation, very low productivity, and so on. Ewen, can you hear us now?
I can. I don't know what happened there, so I didn't hear the introduction.
Well, I was saying that we've had you on before. You've been on the forum a couple of times. You are the director of Global Britain, which is a pro-Brexit campaigning organisation, an information organisation. You're also a member of the Growth Commission, where the former Prime Minister Liz Truss is a very active member. And what you didn't hear me say was that the whole world has noticed that Britain changes its prime minister every 18 months or so. It's become a bit of become part of the unwritten constitution, hasn't it, for a politician to traipse out in front of the door of number 10 and give a self-pitying speech about how he tried his best, but whatever. Is this political instability a symptom of something deeper, Ewen? I know that you're one of the most lucid and I would say pessimistic analysts about Britain. You've said to me in our chats that it's the most advanced in decadence, in its economic decay, the United Kingdom. Tell us how you understand these things, Ewen. Go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of points there. We're outdoing Italy in terms of the number of prime ministers, and it's becoming a little bit like being a Premier League football manager, and that it's a symptom of something worse, isn't it? Everyone comes into number 10, whatever their hue, with some optimism, and very quickly it fades. The media turn against them, the public turn against them. They can't get anything done. And actually, I think we're in a very advanced situation in this country where the Westminster is theatre, and the real decisions aren't taken in this theatre. We, for the last 25 years or so, we've had right-wing governments, left-wing governments, coalition governments, and the general policy drift is the same. And that policy drift has been an increase in woke ideology. It's been an increase in taxation, increase the size of the state. It's been an increase in migration. The trend has been, regardless of who's won the election, and famously, Boris Johnson promised the opposite of everything he did, and he did it all in spades. So why is this happening? There isn't an easy answer to that. that question. But I think it really goes back to the Blair years, where the man was a genius, an evil genius, but a genius all the same, where he changed the British Constitution and he moved away from largely Westminster to a legal system, a media which does the government's bidding largely, certainly the mainstream media, to an academic class which is largely funded by the government of the day. There's a quangocracy which takes a third of all government expenditure. And then there's the general incompetence of the system. So, Britain actually spends, to give you one example, 60 or 70 billion a year on defense. And there was a little problem in Cyprus and they couldn't even send one warship. And the French were able to send 8 warships. So what's going on here? We're actually spending a lot of money in defense, but we're not getting much bang. And you could look at health and get the same results. We could look at virtually every vertical, and you will see extremely poor outcomes. So Britain has moved, I would say, a generation ago from probably being one of the beacons of Europe, not the only beacon, but one of a small number of countries that was performing well. It was getting inward investment, and it was basically fairly low tax. The state was of a reasonable size. The government debt was quite low. The population was fairly stable. And within a generation, the opposite has happened. And I think the country is confused. Almost nobody I meet is pleased about what's happened. The country is deeply upset by what's happened. But there are 3 broad responses to this. One response is anger from the right. And there's no doubt that the right has gained some traction. But it is some traction. But equally, there's a smaller knot of quite far left progressives who have moved further to the left. And they're the ones largely in power. And then there are probably 50 or 60% of the population in the middle. And frankly, they can see there's problems. They're probably not affected by the problems quite as much as people might be in parts of big cities. But they're just trying to cling on to whatever wealth they've got. And they don't want to rock the boat. So it's a very simplistic analysis. But the country is deeply fractious. It's getting poorer relatively for many people. There are hot spots in the country. So parts of central London still look pretty well. Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, 1 or 2 other places are doing really quite well. But large parts of the country are struggling and are hollowed out. And the place is a bit of a tinderbox, really. If
but from what you're describing, I mean, I can't really decide. Obviously, being an outsider, I mean, this is either a hyper ideological state or a state with no ideology whatsoever. Because then, what explains all this volatility? But you end up with the same outcomes all of the time. I mean, John's right. I mean, watching one prime minister go after another, it's good theater. I mean, it's good for chuckles, okay? But it doesn't tell me anything about how the UK is governed or not governed at all. And if you say that, so many people are disaffected, then why is the West so adamant about the march of democracy? It doesn't sound like democracy has a good cadence in the UK.
There's a small knot of ideologically committed leftists, okay, but who undoubtedly have wreaked havoc, in my view, and they believe in open borders, they believe in extreme woke ideology, they believe in the magic money tree, the fact that the government can print whatever it wants and spend what it wants. They believe in a universal basic income, all this sort of stuff. They're very, very far left, and a generation ago wouldn't have been taken seriously. The majority of people do not buy into that, okay? But what there is a very large managerial class in government. And that managerial class, I think, moves at a snail's pace. They sort of do what they're told. They've bought into. They haven't philosophically bought into the ideology, but they know where their bread is buttered. So. And also, there's a whole lot of think tanks and quangos that have been set up that are funded by the state. And funnily enough, those think tanks and quangos boast of the ideology of the state. Now, I'll give you an example.
Well, that's circular.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I produced an economic paper for somebody, for a politician, arguing for some tax cuts. It was a reasonably well thought out paper, and the tax cuts amounted to 2 billion on a budget of 75 billion. Okay, so a rounding error of cuts, really, quite a modest mainstream sort of idea. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, which the BBC heralds as its favourite economic think tank, criticised this paper quite violently. Again, not against me, against the politician who published it. And I did a second piece of work for the guy, and it was to look at who is the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And in actual fact, the numbers are going to give you a broadly right. So I'm not going to say the right to the nearest pound, but about 80% of their money comes from central government in one form or another, and another 7 or 8% comes to the European Union. So virtually all their funding is coming from the state. And funnily enough, anyone that argues to cut the state gets beaten over the head. And this is one example. It's in the same in health policy, gender ideology, migration, economics, you name it, net zero. These think tanks are all funded by the state, and they all appear to be independent. So when the Guardian or the BBC quote them, they sound quite official, quite good people. But actually, they're not independent at all. And I think it's a corruption of democracy.
There's no doubt it's a corruption of democracy. There's no doubt that Liz Truss is right when she says that politicians don't control anything, even the most powerful ones. But I'm wondering, to what extent this is a problem that affects the whole of Europe. I was talking to one of the senators from Forum for Democracy last weekend, and he had written, but unfortunately not finished, a PhD thesis showing how the managerialism and the kind of political change that we see in all our countries, in some countries more than others, combine to make accountability absolutely impossible. So if you start a big project that lasts, I don't know, some infrastructure project that lasts, let's say, 5 years or 10 years beyond the usual political term, the whole thing goes out of budget. But the people who took the original decisions are by then out of power. And so there's no one left to carry the can. And add to this is what you've just said, which is the quangocracy, which is government funding money into organizations which then plead various causes, whether it's on immigration or whatever. You've just outlined that, Ewen. And then, of course, you have the other crazy thing, which is, as you hinted at earlier when you were talking about Tony Blair, is these NGOs, these quangos, then, of course, taking things to the courts and operating against the government with the government's money. So, for example, on deportation or whatever, the government pays for its own policies to be sabotaged. So, but how do we understand this sort of suicidal drift? Because it's throttling every single European country. And in addition, these same people, the same managerial class, the thing that they hate most of all is countries they describe as authoritarian, where the boss is the one who decides and he's the one who carries the can. It's a very curious psychological
well, John, since you mentioned
pathology.
That, I mean, it seems to me that the least understood, because it was badly written and badly thought out, was Lenin's State and Revolution. But it seemed to have come to fruition in the West. It didn't come to fruition in what would become the Soviet Union. Because it goes back to my original question. I mean, where does ideology play a role here? Because, it just seems like this is, if ideology is, it's the ideology of the administrative state, which means policy is really not that important. It's what's necessary to keep the administrative state functioning. And as we know, after any kind of revolutionary movement, those that inherit the power do everything they can to maintain it. Now, maybe Blair was the revolution, I don't know. But it seems like more of keeping the status. This is an ideology of the status quo.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Actually, the American Constitution was founded under "we the people." Now we can either believe that or not. I know it's rhetoric, but and the idea was it would be decentralized and all the rest of it. But what has happened here is that we the people fund the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy have become a pathogen, and actually are now the machine controlling the people.
That's it.
And we're seeing this. And there was a guy in the 1950s called Parkinson, and he developed something called Parkinson's Law. And it was a very simple idea that each year, and you can actually model it, the bureaucracy generally increases by 7%. And this has been happening. If we were to take the British Foreign Office and look at it when Britain, a quarter of the world was pink, literally the Foreign Office employed about 200 people.
I know.
The Department of Agriculture employed about 10 people. Minuscule numbers. Now we have got the state controlling 44% of the British GDP. It's more in France, by the way. But it's much more than 44% because they regulate industries which are notionally private to an inch of their lives. So net zero in the energy sector, the banking sector, the insurance sector, employment law has reached unparalleled levels, and so the list goes on. I sort of joke with people that Britain's become the world's first non-economy economy, because actually there's a little economy where people actually do stuff, but it's quite small. It's probably 25, 30% that is truly private. And I think Britain's not unique in this, and it would be, what I think is shocking about the British case is that Britain's moved from a position of relative freedom to significant unfreedom, but also with a public sector that frankly doesn't work. At least in some European countries, the public sector is a little bit more effective. We might not like it, or we might think the state's too big, or whatever the case might be. But Britain's got the worst of all worlds: high taxes, massive debt, an ideological state which imposes its worldview on its citizens, and a public sector that is at best patchy and at worst useless. But backed up actually by a state media that gives let's just be polite and say a very partial view of reality, and doesn't brook substantial opposition. So there still is debate on X and on some Substacks, but in the mainstream, that debate is not encouraged. In fact, does not happen apart from very, very rarely. So we've got a very tight democracy where you can debate and get very heated with people whether tax should be 20p or 20.5p. Yeah. But you try and debate something substantive. And I'll give you one example of this. Some parties now support mass migration. Burnham seems to do that openly. But the Conservative Party historically have not, although they've done the opposite. But what has happened now is that, and I'm not sure it was Conservative or Labour, but my understanding, and I will use the word understanding carefully, reached a long-term contract, a multi-year contract with Serco to provide services for illegal migrants. So if they were serious about ending that problem, they wouldn't sign a multi-year contract. Yeah. They wouldn't be expecting it to be a multi-year contract. So what they're trying to do is manage the situation.
Manage the situation they had themselves created.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one example.
You just said you don't know if it was Labour or Conservative. You just said that.
Yes. Yeah. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. Now, if you want a little bit of good news, okay, I think a radical government still has levers, okay? So if a government won a mandate, it would be possible to defund the quangocracy, move that under ministerial control, and curtail spending and try and grow the economy. And you could, if you were serious about ending migration, there's all sorts of things you could do there. But it would take a radical government to do it, and it would need a very well thought out plan. Now, the good news is that amongst those on the right, some in the Conservative Party, a lot of people in Reform and Restore are talking about how they do this. Have they come up with a foolproof plan yet? It's work in progress. But at least amongst the right, there's the beginning to understand that the country is in very, I would go as far as to say, existential trouble. Existential trouble. And
I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago at a remigration conference in Norway, and for what it's worth, I tried to say what I thought the economic causes were of migration, and how remigration could be encouraged systemically, not just by putting people on planes, but by removing the incentive removing the underlying causes of mass migration, which of course is, as we know, is a phenomenon that touches the whole of Europe. And it seems to me, and I'd be interested to know in your view, because you're an economist and I'm not, that surely high tax on labour, which even in Britain is well over 30%, and in France, when you add in the social charges, is probably more like 85%. High tax on labour is surely the main systemic driver of mass migration, for the simple reason that obviously if you tax something, you make it more expensive, and therefore in order to keep things under control, you have to increase the supply, in this case through migration, to attenuate the consequences of the problem you've just caused by high tax on labour. I'm not aware that anyone else in politics in Britain or elsewhere is thinking along those terms. We had income tax cuts about 40 years ago under Nigel Lawson, but I'm not aware that anyone has ever commented on this extraordinary imbalance between the extremely high levels at which labour is taxed, again all over Europe, but including in Britain, and the extremely low levels at which other things are taxed. Imports, for example, are taxed typically at a very, very low level. Even VAT is only 20%. Is this conversation taking place at all, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
I think why is there mass migration, and what are the impacts of it? Well, I don't blame people for wanting to come to Europe. If you lived in Somalia or wherever it might be, why wouldn't you? You'll be entitled to a minimum wage, which in the UK case is 13 or 14 pounds, about 13 pounds an hour. That's many times a middle class wage in that part of the world, many times. The English language is a pool. You'll get free education. You'll get free hospital care, and you'll also be living in a Europe largely, despite its many problems and its clear and obvious decline, is still relatively safe. Many parts of the world are not relatively safe.
Yeah.
So the quality of life here is infinitely better than other parts of the world, and that is a massive factor behind migration flows. In the UK case, I think it's a spending problem. So the reason that labour is taxed highly is that the government has chosen to spend 360 billion a year on welfare. Now, some of that is old age pensions, but half of that is not. It's working age bailout, and we've got a problem with 9.1 million people of working age choosing not to work for a variety of reasons, from an endemic problem of mental health, which and physical disability. The country is becoming sick, or at least people believe they're sick. We could debate whether they are, but and it's a very easy solution for the NHS and others to take labour from wherever it might be to plug gaps, and it's also depressed labour costs. It's obviously the case. You increase the supply, the price.
Yeah, but the need to depress the labour costs comes from the fact that labour is artificially expensive as a result of tax. So it's a classic example of.
That's undoubtedly part of it. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a pub company in the UK called Wetherspoons, and they quite a big pub company. They sell fairly cheap beer. It's a perfectly good chain, and in their annual accounts, they actually laid out what their costs were. And again, these numbers are roughly right, but the proportions are correct. They've got 1.1 billion of sales. The government took over 600 million of that. So in other words, for every pint of beer, and they took that in labour costs, in business rates, in beer levies, in the net zero premium, blah blah blah. So every time you bought a pint of beer, more than half of that cost came from the government. So the government is out of control, not just in Britain, but across Europe. It's spending dramatically more, providing limited and poor services, taxing people and importing new people into the country, which is having a radical impact on the culture now, and indeed the demos.
If you spend more than you earn, you have to borrow to find the difference. And all European countries are in the same boat. France is worse in terms of percentage of GDP, or slightly worse, but better because of lower interest rates in terms of the absolute numbers. Britain, as I understand, borrows 150 billion a year, and of that 110 billion goes on servicing the debt, which is something close to bankruptcy. How come the bond market, how come the gilts are still afloat? The rates have gone up, they're less attractive than they were, but surely we're staring at some sort of financial collapse, or have we discovered the way to defy gravity in the Eurozone and in Britain?
I would caution. What you said is correct. Okay, so in the UK context, 3 trillion of debt. That's gone up tenfold in a generation, literally. So, between the Napoleonic Wars and 2000, Britain's debt was 300 billion. Within a generation, it's 10 times that, 3 trillion, for no obvious benefit. No obvious benefit. In fact, services may be worse. As you say, it's about 110, 120 billion a year in debt reservicing. That's increasing. And the actual numbers are worse than that because there are off-balance sheet elements and there's contingent liabilities, and there was a Scottish economist, actually, called Adam Ferguson in the 17th century. And he had a very simple theory. He said that you can no longer be a great power if you spend more on debt interest than you do on defence. Now, in the British case, Britain spending 110, 120 billion on debt interest and about 60 billion on defence. So go figure. France, not as bad as that. Germany's in a strong position, actually. And it's getting worse. Germany is burning its inheritance, but its current position of debt to GDP is moderate. But it's got subtly different problems to Britain. I'm very happy to talk about that if you want. But the current position of Germany is reasonably strong. America has just breached that Ferguson's rule. So it's about $1 trillion in interest and about $1 trillion on its military. Now, that doesn't mean to say that America's done now, but it means to say that there's an amber light, and they need to be careful, because if they continue debasing their currency and coinage by running excessive fiscal deficits, which seems to be the political will between the Republicans and the Democrats, they will undermine their position. Now, in the British case, we've got a spendthrift chancellor. We're running a large deficit. We've got record taxes. Why isn't there a crisis? Why hasn't sterling collapsed? Why hasn't interest rates gone through the roof? Well, first of all, the UK is seen as a bad credit risk. 10-year long bond is about 5%. That's the highest in the G20. That's 2 points higher than Germany, if not more than that. It's higher in America. It's higher than any other G20 country. So Britain is seen as a bad political bet, a bad economic bet, and a bad inflationary bet. And I understand that, and I think the market's pricing that probably correctly. However, the level of debt hasn't reached an unsustainable tipping point. Because governments have the right to, if you believe they're a pathogen, they will just tax more. And they have shown twice in the last decade that they're prepared to print. And this, particularly the second round of QE, was catastrophic. It was inflationary. Who benefits from inflationary? The government, because it's under outlying debt.
Yeah.
So, it's very difficult for a country to go bust if they have a central bank. If they do not have a central bank, they've got to, in the case of Ireland and Greece, they've got to cut spending. It's as simple as that, So, however, there is a price for a country that runs consistent deficits, and that price is probably inflation, which makes the population poorer and undermines confidence. So I think the UK has got itself in a very, very bad square. Can it recover? Maybe, but only because it still has a strong position in a number of industries, not manufacturing particularly, but we're talking about service-related sectors, financial services, cultural assets. Yeah. Some of these are quite valuable. I think if radical action was taken quickly, the UK could be stabilized, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, to take radical action is to first of all, make it obviously clear that we're facing a crisis, and and not everyone is going to be a winner. I mean, you're going to cut social services. I mean, who wants to take that political risk? I mean, what's his name coming in? I mean, because I don't remember any of the names anymore, because I don't think it's important to, because there's going to be a new person in a few months anyway. I mean, how is he different than Starmer?
Well, Andy Burnham isn't different. He will.
Oh, okay, but you get my point. You get my point.
I do. I mean, look, I said it could be rectified. I didn't say it would be rectified.
No, it can be, but it takes political courage and vision to have it. There seems to be kind of a missing thing that was kind of obvious like yesterday, but not anymore. Leadership.
Yeah, I completely agree. The issue is that leadership is not encouraged.
That's right.
Exactly.
So a managerial class does not want mavericks that might take radical action. They want people that will sit in the committee and play to the rules of the game. So now, if you look, I think Britain's crisis today is far greater than the 70s. Okay, far greater. Yeah. Because it's a cultural and moral crisis, not just an economic crisis. In the 70s, the institutions were still broadly conservative. The institutions are now far left. And the country's deeply divided. But Thatcher could not, for good or ill, Margaret Thatcher could not have happened if Britain hadn't gone to the IMF in 1977. It created a narrative that made it possible to change direction. The worst case scenario, and it's my central case, is that we keep on muddling along, no growth, more debt, public sector bailing out any problem that arises, further demographic change, further regulation and control, and should there be a change, and we don't know when the next election will be. Some people think there'll be an election this year. On balance, I think probably not, but there has to be an election by 29 at the latest. That, to my mind, is about the last chance, because if there's another 5 years of progressive government, it starts to become totally enmeshed, and you start to have demographic change that makes it very difficult for the right to win. Now, you see this in a city like London. London used to be sometimes Conservative, sometimes Labour. The Conservative Party's been all but wiped out of London now, and it can't win it again because the degree of cultural change makes it almost impossible for the Conservative Party to win. The same thing's happened to the Republicans in California. Used to be a Republican state, you know.
I was in high school in California, and it was a Republican state. Okay, now it's the people. Now it's the People's Republic of California.
Yeah, and that is why the next election really is critical. But it's not just enough to win the next election, and whoever wins has to enact significant change to undo or start the process of undoing what has happened. Now, to your point, John, I think it was your point, you know, radical change isn't something that comes naturally to the British psyche. And when you have a state media system which mutes and turns down the volume, you know, and people just want to get on with their lives, understandably, it makes it very difficult to do radical things, you know. But if Britain does not prepare to do that, its decline will be baked in, and it will become a radically different place to the country that we have known. Now, Vance and Trump have spotted this, and that's why they're looking for civilizational partners, and they can see that one of their major allies is in very grave danger of rowing in a totally different direction, and permanently. So I think this really is a civilizational moment. Either Britain peers back from the brink, or it doesn't, and it's too soon to be sure which way that's going to go.
But you've mentioned now culture and civilization, these rather intangible things, which I suspect that, like me, you think they are in fact the key to everything. And you mentioned Vance and so on, Trump. Now, I would say that on the civilizational level, and also on more concrete economic matters, like, for example, the critique of globalism, of globalization, Vance gave in the very early weeks, I think, actually gave a wonderful sort of 2 or 3 minute explanation of why globalization had been based on false premises, why you shouldn't separate out production from design and things like that. In other words, he said that he seemed to understand, and you've mentioned, Ewen, that they're in search of civilizational partners, and we saw obviously how Vance went to Budapest to try and help Viktor Orban and so on. I don't get the sense that element is present in Britain. What I mean by that is the obvious. Certainly, the Conservative Party will never provide a radical alternative, because they are part of the problem and have been for many decades. And then we look obviously to Nigel Farage's party, and beyond that to Restore. So Farage is a very impressive politician. He's got Danny Kruger in with him, who I think seems to me to be an extremely intelligent person. But do you think that these people have that depth of understanding that we seem to have seen in America? Because I don't think so.
Yeah, because before you answer, I mean, there's something that I would think it applies to the UK. I mean, someone that is good at retail politics. Okay, I mean, these are good retail politics guys, but does it mean they have ideas, a vision? Okay, what I mean by retail is Mandani in New York City. This guy is quintessential retail politics. Okay, he is charismatic. He's very convincing. His powers as mayor, he can change actually very little. Okay, but the little things that he does are called victories, and people very much like him. But he's a retail politician. He's not an ideologue. He's retail. And Britain, from what we've heard today, needs far more than just retail politics.
It does. It needs a salesman. Okay, so it has to be someone that can tell a story.
Yeah,
and it has to be someone that shines sincerity. And I think so. There's got to be an element of explaining, and it's poorly understood, what the problem is. That it hasn't happened by accident; it's happened by design largely, and how what the plan is, and also to manage expectations. 40 years of decline cannot be overturned in one parliament. Not possible. Not even if the three of us were running the country. We would have to choose, 2 or 3 things that we could really focus on, show they worked, and we need a bit of luck as well, and then in the second and third terms start to do stuff. So to my mind, you've got to get the architecture right. You've got to be in a position you can actually enact what you want to act, and that without being dragged through the courts, so you can achieve nothing or just put into the quagmire of the civil service. So there needs to be the ability to hire and fire ministers. There needs to be a new civil servants, rather. There needs to be a new team of people who are committed to the program brought in. You need to have been fairly clear in your manifesto, so the Lords can't block stuff, and you'd have to get on with making sure there's a proper plurality of the press. There's not a
or you have to declare a national emergency.
Yeah. Well, that's very difficult to do.
I'm sorry, John. Sorry.
Mm.
I know.
No, but Ewen is saying it's very difficult to do, which I think is
That's
right.
what I'm saying.
Yeah,
you're going to wait on the courts? Good luck, guys. Good luck.
You have to change the structure. You can win but you'd have to have enabling acts first, and to do that.
I didn't call it that. I didn't call it that.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to do one or two things. Firstly, not everyone's an ideologue, okay? A lot of people just want to play golf. So you've got to make people feel better. So you'd have to do radical stuff of very quickly cutting the size of the state, particularly the benefits paid to people of working age, and particularly the quangos. You would stop the circular trade, so anyone can argue anything they want, but they have to get funding for it privately, not from the state funding them to articulate the next left-wing idea. So I reckon Boris Johnson increased public spending by 300 billion in real terms. That's on a number of 1.3 trillion, so by about 25%, for no tangible benefit. We've got to claw. It's not practical to claw immediately 300 billion back for a variety of reasons, but we have to claw a good proportion of that back, recycle that into tax cuts. That's one thing. The second thing is Britain has seen tremendous demographic change. That the UK is one of the most crowded islands as a matter of fact, in Europe. And that has to be a priority. I think if you focus on those sort of wins, you can then get into the weeds and the detail of looking at and starting to unwind some of the other things that have happened.
Let me give you an example. Okay, NPR in the United States, okay, Looney Tunes, lefty stuff, you know, I mean, the managerial class just loves it. And they cut funding from it. And people are with their arms up in the air and their hair on fire. And people like myself just said, well, NPR caters to a very, very specific segment of the population. Oh, by the way, they're quite affluent. If they want their NPR, you pay for it. Why should the state pay for it?
Of course.
Their listenership is very, very wealthy. Okay. Why should I listen? Why should the state be churning out this garbage? I mean, really nonsense stuff. Okay. But if you're drinking your cappuccino on your private plane and you want to listen to NPR, why don't you pay for it? I don't want to pay for it. That's what you guys have to start doing.
I agree, and it's line by line. So
line by line.
Yeah, and in fairness, there are think tanks in the UK that are looking at this, and stage one is to win the election. If the Progressive Alliance wins again, whenever that next election will be, Britain's got a very, very serious problem, and it may be intractable. So stage one is to win. But stage two is to make sure when you do win, you have a credible plan. And you don't need your salesman to have worked the plan out, but you need the team behind the salesman to have worked that plan out, you know? And it has to be exercised immediately, because you've got probably 2 years, after your victory maximum to get things done. If you look at Donald Trump in America, he's got stuck in Iran, hasn't he? And it's probably blown his presidency up. And with it, the prospects of Vance. So who knows what happens in the midterms? But if you believe the polls, it's not looking good for him. And that's going to change the nature of his presidency. You know, and the same thing will happen to Andy Burnham. I suspect he'll have a 3-month window where the media will love him, and then people will see it's more of the same. But the fundamental problem is the state has ceased to trust the citizen. So we have moved from
and vice versa, I would say. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my own views have morphed in the last 5 or 10 years. There was a series of things which made me question the state in ways I wouldn't have historically have done, and it's now reached a position that you've really got to be pretty blind not to spot that the wheels are coming off.
Or you become part of the problem yourself, my friend. Okay, that's how I look at it.
And obviously, the proportion of people now dependent on the state is very large, and Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So we've got really a very divided population here, and on top of that, QE has caused intergenerational wealth problem, because it's boosted property prices and asset prices, and it's largely meant that the young can't get on the ladder, and you've got to give the young hope. So and there's been no debate about that. That was a managerial class decision, caused a lot of inflation, by the way, it's the unintended consequences, or possibly intended consequences, have been absolutely enormous. So the place is broken in multiple ways. However, Britain's still got good assets, or some good assets. Okay, so it's cultural assets. This might sound a bit ridiculous, but these are big soft power assets. Sporting at Wimbledon's on at the moment. Football, rugby, museums, heritage. The City of London is still very powerful. The London stock market's in structural decline, but that isn't the city really. The city's still doing reasonably well, it's got a decent med tech sector, etc. So there are pockets that could be revitalized.
Well, they could revitalize speech too. Okay,
Ewen, you mentioned
globally, the UK is taking a major hit people going to the UK. Well, that happened to you, John. You got the treatment.
Yeah. Well, the brand Britain, actually, that's Ewan's phrase. Brand Britain has been irredeemably damaged. But Ewan, you said something a moment ago. You said there are one or two good think tanks. Well, you belong to one of them. You've presented wonderful papers on growth and how to achieve it and why we don't have it and all the rest of it. Are you a voice crying in the wilderness, or surely there must be people, politicians who are short of ideas, shopping around and keen for this kind of input?
There are. For example, there's a conference in London in a few weeks' time. It's called CPAC. It's the UK version of the great event. There'll be a lot of senior politicians there. In fairness, Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe are all speaking to significant characters. Okay, and the question is, there's a debate going on in the right now as to who's going to dominate. That's perhaps a little bit more ambiguous than it was a few months ago. But I think it's fair to say that the combined right-wing parties are slightly ahead of the combined left-wing parties. So if I was a betting man, I would say that the Conservative, in inverted commas, alliance would be more likely to win. Whether any party can get a majority outright is a moot point. But I'm not. There are quite a lot of people are drawing the sort of conclusions.
Yeah, but considering the magnitude of the problems that we've discussed here, I would assume that you would need some kind of revolutionary fervor.
There's not.
Fire in your belly.
Yeah. Well, look, there's a proportion of the population. There's a proportion of the population that are deeply upset by what has happened. Okay. But when you have a situation where the BBC's market share has never been lower, but in a way it's not a fact unless the BBC says it's a fact, because, and what do I mean by that? Even though relatively few people watch them any longer, it's only if the Westminster Village takes them seriously. So it's only when they say there's a real problem do the politicians start to pay attention. So you've got a fragmented media. You've got the mainstream that's probably still the most important conduit of information that, to be honest, presents a very different version of reality to the version of reality I see. Let's put it politely like that. And on X, for example, and other platforms, you've got a range of views from at one extreme, Zach Polanski, leader of the Greens, who is brilliant at marketing, but has got some completely idiot ideas. And then you to those on the right giving, so there's a fragmentation, and what there hasn't been is a coalition round, one party or individual. So Nigel Farage is in pole position at the moment, polling somewhere about 25, 26, 27%. That's a good number, but it's not enough. Averages are misleading as well, because it's not uniform throughout the country. In the way you don't want it to be uniform, you want to, have pockets of strength, and probably Reform remains strongest in the north of the country and the Midlands, and the Conservative Party probably in the South East remains strongest. So that, I think people are looking for solutions, and if you like, the cheerleaders for those solutions, the political leaders, are jockeying. But
it's more than jockeying. It's more than jockeying, Ewan. I mean, Nigel Farage would like to destroy the Conservative Party, and Rupert Lowe would like to destroy Nigel Farage.
Well, there's a major problem here that there's antithesis between these various characters, which I don't think can be resolved. Actually, not very easily.
Exactly.
And what they're all trying to do is get in. It's about being in pole position in the opinion polls, because people who are on the right will herd whoever's in pole position in their area rather than split the vote, probably. So you'll get a sort of natural PR system, probably. It's too soon to say how that is going to play out. But what is the case is that the right are sharpening their arguments, and if for the last 30 years, my voice would have been a voice in the wilderness. And John, you've known me for a while. You've known what I've been saying for a long time, and that was very much a minority view.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say it's a majority view now, but I'm going to say it's a lot of people now recognise it to a greater or lesser extent.
Good.
And I think the mainstream parties are starting to come up with ideas that wouldn't have been part of the debate. The Overton window has moved,
right.
but I'm very cautious, because it's not just a question of winning; it's a question of actioning it when you win. Because the scale of what has happened has been so great, and there's such legal vested entrenched interests and managerial interests that a good general does the work behind the scenes and then comes out with a plan, and actions that plan, and that's what those of a similar persuasion to me need to be doing now, and are doing, in fairness, or attempting to do it. But it needs, really expert legal advice. It needs a whole range of skill sets. This is a major rebuild.
Well, I think one indication of going in the right direction, and I mean this seriously, gentlemen, is that maybe I'll be able to distinguish between left and right in the future, because there is none. It's just one big muddle, and and that really, in my life, I for a short time worked in marketing for a major firm, and I was paid very badly. I was treated very badly, but I learned one phrase that has brought me through life, and I mean this seriously. And the question is the reason why. The reason why someone votes for a party. The reason why you buy this coffee or that coffee. The reason why. And this is what the new thinking in the UK is all about. What is the reason? You have to really hone that and focus in on. Give people a reason to actively go out and do something. Okay, because I don't see that now. All I see is kicking the can. Mediocre people all across the political spectrum, and the only ones that get any attention are on the fringes, and they're sympathetic characters. They're actually more sympathetic in many ways than the muddle of the middle. So what's the reason why? The reason why is to save our country, to save our civilization. That's the question.
I mean, the Conservative Party were in awe of Tony Blair, and what they reached a deal with the devil that they would go along with Blair's social and liberal worldview, and they would be just slightly to the right. That no longer washes. Okay, so there was no. I was a voice in the wilderness. There was very little debate. But now the centre ground is collapsing, and that's happening in France. It's happening.
That is
in
true.
Belgium, it's happening everywhere.
That is true.
Germany, and people are real. And I went to a friend's house for dinner. Okay, and their father was there, and he used to be a liberal. I was utterly shocked how left-wing he'd become. And I had to seriously bite my tongue over dinner, because he's a very nice man, as it happens, but we just have very different worldviews. And both sides are coming apart, and that's a very dangerous situation. I'm in no doubt that this isn't a time for pussyfooting about. We have got to change the delta if Britain is to survive in any way that I can understand.
Good. Well, let's hope that that's what happens. I mean, I'm always a doomsayer, and I perhaps will finish with this rather gloomy note, which is that even if the right gets together its ideas in the way that we've sketched out, the fact is that the Labour Party currently has an absolute majority of, is it 140 or 170 seats? What is the size of the majority? So as Peter knows, so as Peter knows perfectly well, it's not like in the United States where the the House and the Senate switch on the basis of 1 or 2 seats. It can go from one extreme to another. And it's quite difficult, isn't it, to overturn a majority of such a size. When Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, people said to me, how long will he be Prime Minister for? And I confidently said, 10 years at least, because you can't get rid of an 80-seat majority. Well, now the Labour Party has a majority of more than double what Boris Johnson had. So that's also a big issue. Anyway, Ewen, thank you very much indeed. Ewen Stewart of the Growth Commission. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and you're always welcome on the forum whenever you like. Thanks for watching. Okay.
Thank you.